Welcome to the CTA podcast. Join us as we critically examine the ideological capture of the psychotherapy field. Here we discuss better, common humanity proposals for a fairer society. Our discussions are thought-provoking, and our guests are from diverse backgrounds, bringing unique perspectives to the table. This is the CTA podcast with your hosts, Jaco van Zyl and Christine Siefen.
Welcome, everybody, to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast, CTA. It's good to be here with all of you. I am joined by my co-host, Jaco van Zyl, and our guest today, Leslie Elliott. And Leslie, we're so excited to have you. We know you've made quite a splash in the world of critical social justice and how we fight back. Fight is kind of an aggressive term. I don't love it, but I guess how we advocate to bring back the core values and principles of what therapy really is all about. And you are you're the tip of the spear about highlighting what is going on in the institutions, the educational institutions that are turning out, therapists, and what it's been like as a student. So Leslie Elliott has been outspoken about critical social justice as a graduate student and in the workplace, and has been active in battling authoritarian COVID policies. In October of 2022, she began a series of YouTube videos blowing the whistle on ideological influence in counselor training under the name, quote, The Radical Center, end quote. You can find her videos on YouTube and her writing and documentation on Substack at The Radical Center. Okay, so Leslie, we're so excited to have you with us today. We have a prior relationship, so it's wonderful to be able to have you on our show. I've been on yours multiple times. It happens to be that the school you're talking about, or that you've been blowing the whistle on, happens to be the very one that I resigned from as a professor, just at a different location. So it's sort of serendipitous and full circle to come back to this today and to have you on our show sharing your story. So I know your story well, but our listeners may not, and my co-host may not. So we'd love to hear a little bit about how this all started. How did you get that YouTube channel out? You made a video where you came out and spoke about what was happening in class while you were a student at Antioch in the Seattle campus, it was, I believe. So tell us a bit about kind of winding back, what encouraged you or motivated you to actually speak out? What was the catalyst for that? And then you turned it into this YouTube channel, which now you've gotten so many different hits and a lot of and viewers, and you've become a bit of a movement in and of yourself. So if you can tell us a bit about how that started, that would be great.
Sure. Well, it's really nice to see the two of you today. Thank you so much, Christine and Jaco, for having me for this conversation. Christine, I've really enjoyed our conversations that we've had, and it's been great getting to know you, and it's been really grounding to be able to share experiences about what we've both been, what we both experienced at Antioch. So I went back to school in 2019 as had previously gone to law school and had decided that I didn't want to be an attorney, and had worked for several more years in the medical industry, which is what I'd done to put myself through undergrad and law school. And I wanted a career change, and I started a graduate program at Antioch University of Seattle, the Seattle campus. And it was a clinical mental health counseling program. At first, I was struck right away by some aspects of the engagement that were different to me from what I'd experienced previously in university and in law school, like the giving of pronouns, the requesting of gender pronouns, third person gender pronouns in introductions was really strange to me, and I thought it seemed unhealthy and out of place in an applied psychology program. But it also seemed like maybe this is the way the culture is going, so I can just get through this and not really get caught up in this if the rest of the program feels pretty solid. And there were some really good aspects of the program. So there was really solid skills training and some courses that were valuable and where I learned a lot. But there was this undercurrent of this thing that I didn't have a way to articulate yet, that I came to understand as social justice ideology. To me, when I saw the word social justice in the school's mission statement prior to that, it didn't set off an alarm for me, because I thought, well, who doesn't want social justice? That sounds like a good thing. And if we're going into a helping profession like counseling, of course, we want people to have the best possible social outcomes, and we want that for the most people possible. So it just seemed like a very benign and positive thing to me at the time. But as I kept going through the program, there were places where the ideology really didn't, it seemed like it not only didn't make sense, but it seemed outright harmful. Like the racial stuff was really, it was really shocking to me that we were being told to see people in terms of race in these really, I want to use the word black and white categories, but like, no pun intended. And as I progressed through the program, there were times when I had conflicts with professors around this, and but it really came to a head for me in 2022. So last year, when I tried for the second time to take a course that was a required course, and came up against a civility pledge that I had to sign in order to proceed into the course. And it was the civility pledge that pledged to like a perpetual interrogation of racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, and privileged and marginalized identities. And I was supposed to sign off and say that I believe in this. And that felt very ideological. It felt very, it went against my conscience to sign something that I believed to be an ideology that I didn't believe in, and I would not be forced to do that. So I had to drop the course for the second time, and I found myself kind of at a dead end. And I was almost at the end of my coursework at this point. And so I put out this video after speaking with a faculty advisor about it and getting nowhere. The feedback was, we know we're not training counselors that are going to be able to work with Trump supporters. And I thought,
they said that? Excuse me for a second. Did they actually say that?
No, she actually said that. Yes. Yeah, she actually said that.
So 50% of the United States, let's just be honest here, 50% of the United States. Okay.
Yeah. And that had been the tone. I mean, I guess I'm kind of giving you this rambly story. I should have it like really cinched up by now and have a really great way to articulate the narrative. But it's still, as I go back through it, it's still, I'm doing some processing of this whole experience still. But yeah, I reached out to a faculty advisor and I said, I'm kind of concerned about some of this stuff with the social justice ideology. I don't always feel like I'm aligning with these things, and it feels really heavy-handed. And her response was, well, if you don't like it, you better get through the program as fast as possible, because it's only going to increase. And she said, we are aware that we are training counselors who are not going to be able to work with Trump supporters. And I thought at that point, how can you have a psychology program that maligns half of the political spectrum? I mean, I don't care where you are on it personally. I think we should be able to respect each other's differences, but it's not like an illegitimate thing to be a Republican. I mean, that shouldn't be
it's absolutely horrifying, because I experienced that in the classroom all the time. But the difference is there was no institutional person or
endorsement of that.
None. Yeah. Not in a way that was that overt. I mean, this is just right. She's literally saying this. This is sort of why
as my faculty advisor. Yeah, I know.
Does that mean that they wouldn't be able to alleviate suffering if a person happened to support Trump? So in other words, they were training counselors to actively withhold help, withhold healing, withhold treatment, if the recipient of such treatment happened to believe something different from what they believed in. in any possible world, how could that be considered moral?
No, and it really wasn't. So the first introduction I had to this kind of thinking was really in my second quarter at Antioch. I took this class called Multicultural Perspectives, which was a required core part of the curriculum. I believe it was supposed to be a first quarter class, but I was taking it in second quarter. So this is your introduction to the program, really,
Yes.
is this course. And it was I struggle to describe this as a legitimate class because it was taught at such a base level. It felt like like an orientation for eighth graders. You know, the way that the intellectual level on which this was being taught was very, very low. It was the sharing of memes, of YouTube videos. There was some book work, but most of it was social media kind of stuff, content that we were being shown, and it was being used as examples of racism, of systemic racism, and the focus was very heavily on white privilege and how it's bad to be white. And so go ahead, Christine.
Can I ask you how it felt as a white woman in that classroom? Can you just kind of take us through, put us in your shoes of what that was like for you?
It made me really angry. I felt like I was absolutely shocked that I was sitting there listening to someone with a PhD in counseling or psychology who was leading a course and saying things like referring to white women as Becky's, basic bitches, nothing special, talking about white women's tears. And she shared the way she talked about the white women's tears trope was, she said, have you heard the one about white women's tears? And then she went on to talk about it. And then she said it like it was like this is a playful kind of humorous thing. And if she had been using this as an example of how we should ignore these tropes and see people as individuals, that would have been one thing, but she was actually using it as a way to showcase what we should take forward with our clients, that white women's tears have been, or the emotions of white women have been historically overvalued. And so it is our job as counselors to set that record straight with our clients, use them as a clinical opportunity to change who we value, whose emotions we value. And in fact, there was one where one student brought up a conflict, an intersectional conflict, where there was a student, or a soccer player who refused to wear a rainbow jersey because she was Catholic, something like that. So she didn't support the LGBT thing, and she didn't want to wear the rainbow pride jersey for her team. And the teacher said, oh yeah, but she was a white woman. So she kind of gave this shrug. And when the student said, actually, no, she was a person of color, the teacher goes, oh, okay, well, in that case. And it was like, now we'll take this seriously. And so there were lots of incidents like this. And this course was just, like I said, it was taught like it was being taught to middle schoolers, except that you wouldn't teach middle schoolers this kind of hateful stuff if you had any scruples, I suppose.
How simplistic, isn't it? It was actually a portrayal of their own simplistic understanding of multiculturalism.
Mm-hmm.
It struck me too, in our training, the situation in South Africa is slightly different. But due to my background, I got heavily involved with people of different backgrounds. First of all, growing up among African people, but also I had a religious phase in my life when I was expected to do some preaching among people of different religious backgrounds, and I got into contact with Muslims and Hindus, and that actually enabled me to get a deeper understanding of their worldview. And many years later, more than a decade later, when I applied for selections, also at master's level, it was interesting to notice how shallow some of these attempts were to demonstrate and to signal multiculturalism, not only among certain students, but also among some of these lecturers who were preaching multiculturalism. Like you said, it's very simplistic. It's also almost stereotypical. It doesn't really take the person with their worldview, with the individual set of meaning-making patterns into account, and using that in the therapy field. It is really just a stereotypical imposition of predetermined biases, imagining that you're multicultural now.
Well, and I think too that there's deception with that word. I want to just go back to something that you mentioned earlier, Leslie, because I think it ties in perfectly to what you're talking about, Jaco. But you said something about social justice sounding like a good thing. And I have said this a million times.
Yeah.
A lot of these movements have started with what was proposed to be good ideas, things that we would look at and say, well, gee, of course. So tell us a little bit more about that and what your thoughts were, and how did you then come to see it as something that was actually harmful, that it was something that was actually cloaked in this, it's virtue signaling, we'll say, that this is a good thing. And then when you really peel the layers back, this is what you find is the racism, essentially, and everything they're supposedly fighting against. So tell us a little bit about kind of, you know, that moment when you thought, gee, you know, this sounds like a good idea, social justice, let's say, and then when you really discovered what it truly meant.
Well, I think that I think the phrase had been used in institutions that I'd been to before. I believe social justice was part of the mission statement for the Catholic University where I got my undergrad training. And that was a wonderful school. It was a great school. And I want to say Seattle University, where I went to law school, had social justice in their mission statement. This just didn't raise any alarms to me because I'd always, I guess I never really had interrogated that phrase. I'd never really looked at it to say, what is actually meant by this? Because it's just a nice gloss. It just felt like if I had to say what I thought it would be, I would think it meant striving for the best possible opportunity for the most number of people to achieve a good life, you know, the basics that are needed in order to have the opportunity to grow and have access to food and water and education, et cetera. So I would have thought of it in just this like benevolent, let's push for a better world, you know, and now that I think about that, it's like, well, how, and what does that mean? And there's a lot to unpack there, and who's deciding what's better for whom. And so I'm not quite so naive about it now, but at the time, I guess it was just this given to me. It just seemed like generally, like it's a positive thing. We're moving for a better society. What I came to understand it to mean instead is I understand now that it's part of critical social justice ideology, which is its own thing. It's not a vague, benevolent phrase. It's actually a set of ideas that seek to level the playing field, so to speak, and sort of bring everybody down to the lowest common denominator, and to engage people in a perpetual interrogation of social dynamics where they're seeking opportunities for resentment and places to resent self or others for any perceived advantage, social advantage. So it's an elimination of social advantages is what really social justice ideology represents. And so that's been the arc of my understanding of it. And Jaco, when you say that the multiculturalism teaching is very superficial and very shallow, this was what really struck me. I went to undergrad at St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas. I was in the psychology program for undergrad. I had the opportunity to take master's level clinical psychology courses for undergrad credit because I had a lot of transfer credits that didn't come through when I was transferring from another university. And so my faculty mentor was the chair of the psych department, and she offered me that opportunity to take some of those in a more interesting forum. So I had taken some of these advanced clinical psychology courses previously, and even just my basic undergrad training revealed this depth of psychology to me that I found so fascinating. That's why I was drawn to this study of human behavior in the first place. I found the nuance of human behavior just endlessly interesting. And this reductive ideology is the opposite of the stuff that I was being taught previously. It's absolutely 180-degree difference from what was being taught previously. It's like we're going to take everything that there is about being a person and reduce it and flatten it down and tell you that this is how white people act, and this is how Black people act, and this is how Asians act. And it's absolutely ridiculous, and flew in the face of my intuitive understanding and my experience as a human being, but also my previous psychology training. So I think that that's such a good point that you're making there.
In you relating that experience, it sounded very much like that lecturer was rather resentful. It sounded to me like she would gloat at the suffering of white people, the type of schadenfreude that she might have towards white people and white people's suffering, which is quite interesting. It's fascinating to imagine someone being as sadistic, having to offer what is supposed to be therapy, healing.
And she was white herself, so that's kind of interesting.
Goodness.
I mean, she was a blonde-haired woman with pale skin who identified as Latina, but it was like she was doing everything she could in order to distance herself from the idea of being white. And
was there a moment in time for you where you felt any shame or any guilt around it? I mean, because they do seek to make white people feel horrible, right? Whether white males are the absolute worst, but number two, second in line to being the worst are white women. I mean, I'm talking about straight white men and then straight white women, right? So you're right there on the next rung of the ladder. So I'm just curious about, did they ever succeed, or at least at one point before you sort of realize what was going on, did they succeed at creating that in you, a feeling of guilt or a feeling of just toxicity or
disgust,
internalized in some way?
Not at all. But what I will say, I did feel, I had, so I grew up in South Texas. I grew up in San Antonio, and where I lived was mostly Hispanic neighborhood. So the white people were the minority when I was a kid where I lived. And I got bullied a lot. Bullying it's a big part of my own personal experience, being racially bullied, being hated for being white, being called white trash, being called a honky, being called weta, and just whatever. I was not me. I was seen as a representative of being white, and that was something to look down on. And that was so this social justice anti-whiteness is nothing really new to me, but I'd had to come out of that and sort of become okay with being who I am, and just being not being embarrassed of it. I grew up being embarrassed that I was white. So it wasn't a thing that social justice had to plant on me. But what I felt like I realized over time through those experiences was just that there's in-group and out-group dynamics that apply all over the place for all kinds of reasons. People tend to be pretty tribal. There's reasons to pick on some people when they look different than you, and it happens across all cultures. Absolutely. And for lots of different reasons. And it's not a thing that white people have that cornered the market on, nor have Hispanics, nor have Asians, nor have Black people. It's just a thing that happens, and we'll find it anywhere we go where there's somebody who stands out. And so I felt like it really, if anything, it made me more empathetic to people who experience that kind of minority stress. I feel like it added something to my ability to empathize and to understand what that experience is like for other people. Where I felt some shame in this course was that I just really recoiled from the attempt to foster a sense of victimhood and resentment. And my strongest story in refutation of the material we were being taught was my personal background and my personal anecdotes, where I could point to this and say, no, like your white identity formation model doesn't apply to all white people, because hello, I've lived this. I haven't, they've got these really strict identity formation models where white people don't see people of any other color for the first couple of years of their life. And as soon as they see them, they think they're less than them. And it's this like whole system that you're supposed to agree to. And I'm like, no, that's not true. Maybe that's true for some people, but I can tell you it's not for me. And what I didn't want to do, and what I struggled with, was I didn't want to share my story because it felt like competitive victimhood. It felt like if I tell
Right.
you my story, I'm just telling you here, I'm a cry for me instead. And I don't want to do that because so I struggled with that, and I ended up doing it in these journals that were an assignment. We were supposed to turn in a journal every week that was to be held confidentially between the student and the professor. And in these journals, I wrote to her about my own childhood experiences and how these things are directly in contradiction to the way that we're being told that white people are supposed to experience the world. And yet here I am, and I'm white. How do you explain that? And I felt a lot of shame later when I found that she had shared those with other people without my permission. And because it's just very private information.
Other students or other faculty?
Other social justice counselors. There was another person in particular that I discovered last summer that she had shared my information with. So when I, she'd given them the link to my Google Drive and you could, this was a part of
huge violation of your own, confidentiality, privacy, which as therapists, we know that is the most sacred piece. Am I right, Jaco, of the relationship is the confidentiality and the rapport that's built through feeling that you're in a quote unquote safe space. That word's been hijacked too, but at least that the idea behind it is that you're able to say what you think and feel, and that you're not going to be received with judgment and with, scrutiny and criticism, etc. Am I right, Jaco?
It just shows you the level of malevolence.
Absolutely.
The minds of such people, such that they could justify it within their own minds, that they could treat what is sacred, what is very, very delicate, like it was just commonplace, worthy to be shared and possibly even be mocked and pulled apart, etc. It is just, it's unthinkable.
It's unthinkable. It's a core value of the relationship of client and therapist.
There's no attitude there.
Yes.
She shared about 5 of my 9 journals with this woman. And when I discovered this, I went back and I read the confidentiality clause in our syllabus, and it was the highest degree of confidentiality. It was just like what you would expect in therapy. There were the only exceptions to confidentiality for this were if it seemed that I was going to be hurting, danger to myself or others, or if I was revealing that someone was being abused. So those were the only limits to confidentiality. And yet she shared them. And I filed a grievance. I filed an official grievance with Antioch. I went through the entire grievance process. Eventually, they investigated themselves and found that nothing wrong had been done, and that it was fine for her to share my information with whom she saw fit, because she was the professor, despite the confidentiality agreement. And I appealed the grievance, and my appeal was just ignored. And that was in October. And so it was this grievance process was so unsatisfactory. The faculty advisor telling me about the Trump supporters and the civility pledge came through. All of these things kind of all at once. And then there was the final straw was another biased political missive from the dean of students, or maybe it was the chancellor. And all of these things converged, and I saw this continuing education promo for sexual counseling. I don't know what it was. It was some sort of sexual health thing for AFAB people. So it was assigned female at birth. And AFAB people with vulvas is what it was. And I thought, gosh,
I didn't even know what that meant.
Is just, actually, I know.
So
that's how I learned.
Us.
Yeah. It was just so many things converging. And I thought, this school is, how can I in good conscience continue to put any money or any of my patronage into a program that just seems like it's really churning out this ideology. It's just
zombified.
I mean, a bit of inside baseball here to what it's worth, being on the other side of it when I was a professor and a faculty, a student advisor. People do share with each other, and the goal of that, or the reason behind it, is to raise a flag on whether or not they think the student's appropriate to stay in the program. Meaning, if that is shared and it is determined between the advisor and the professor that that student is not going to make a good therapist because what they wrote or what they said in class, they deem to be questionable or unacceptable or in any way sort of anti, showing a different point of view, that gets then run up the flagpole in order to start the process of getting rid of that student. So that's kind of behind the curtain here, inside baseball on what actually happens to the confidentiality that you have with your professor, which means that you have zero, is my point. And all of that ends up going against you. And that is a problem that I had on the other side of it when I was a professor, is that that's exactly what we were doing. And some students maybe needed that because they were, aggressive or verbally assaultive in class, but not students like you or how you were presenting. That is not what we were looking for. And so this to me is completely misuse of their power in a sense.
That was my sense as well. And I I don't want to belabor it, but just to clarify, that confidentiality didn't apply to all of our coursework. It was just to the journals. It was like the special carve out for the journals.
Yeah.
Like these journals are only between the student and the professor and absolutely will not be shared outside of this relationship.
That's wrong.
And so, it was really
It's not justification. You were invited to share very intimate and sensitive material. You were invited to go into your own darkness, work with it, to use your lecturers or course leaders almost as someone who could accompany you through your reflective processing of what you had gone through. There is absolutely no excuse for her to share this information with anyone else.
But I will say I have done that before when I was a professor, but the context around it is that this person said that I hated men. I was a man hater. And to me, what the flag raised is, okay, how are you going to work with women then? If that's what you're seeing in what we're doing together. So this is why I did that, because to me, it was like, well, if you're telling me I'm a man hater, I don't really think I've done anything that expresses that, then we have a problem here on our hands. So that is the one time in which I did it, because I wasn't sure he was right for the program if he was going to make a blanket statement like that. It had nothing to do with what he was talking about, his own personal story, his own personal history, his own personal sacred, secrets or material things he holds personally close to him. It had to do with him actually sort of verbally. Yes, right. And in that moment I thought, well, gee, how is he making this judgment that I hate men? It turned around and he ended up thinking I was the greatest thing since sliced bread. That's a long story. The point is that in general, that rule should stick. And that's the only way in which we should ever be using that. And the fact that that person used it in a way that's not under that umbrella, in a personal journal that has nothing to do with you attacking her personally and everything to do with your own story. This is absolutely ludicrous. And this is lawsuit worthy, in my opinion.
Well, yeah. And I agree. And one of the journals, it was in response to a discussion in class where she talked about women of color and domestic violence and how white women don't experience these things that like women of color do. And it was this, again, very simplistic. And so I had written to her because I didn't want to share this in class. So I used my journal for it. And I wrote about a time when I was a victim of domestic violence and how that happened and the involvement of law enforcement and this horrible experience in my life, this really painful thing that I opened up about and gave a lot of detail about. And this was one of the things that she chose to share. And so it's just really personal. Like she mined my personal info to share it with somebody else for the purpose of what, I don't know, but it was shared long after I was out of the course too. So that was another thing that was really disturbing. Antioch refusing to even offer an apology. An apology would have gone a long way for me. Just somebody saying, yeah, that we can see how that really violated your confidence. And it was a judgment call, but we're sorry that happened. They could have done it even without taking responsibility. They could have just apologized, but instead it was just, they rallied around the teacher and there was
They dug
nothing.
in their heels.
Yeah, yeah.
I was wondering about something else. In one of your interviews, you mentioned there was a dispute, there was a discussion around something. I can't exactly remember what the topic was. And then one of your fellow students put up his or her hand and said that there are way too many white voices being overrepresented in this discussion. And that made me wonder about something. How did these developments affect your relationship among yourselves as students?
That's a good question. So that incident was the review. We did we had not been given the opportunity to review this course, which was something that students were raising with their faculty advisors. We want to review this course. Other people were unhappy with the same course that I'm talking about right now. And so the teacher, in lieu of doing the official review process, gave us a day to give our feedback in class. And when I was giving my feedback in class, I said I thought that we had stayed on the surface of a lot of these issues, and that I thought it was important for us to address multiculturalism and to address issues of race and racial tension. But I felt the way that it had been done in this course was almost to present a caricature, and I thought we should have gone deeper and had deeper discussions about these issues. To which the teacher, she began to cry and told me that she hadn't been able to provide a safe space, and that's why she had used her own emotional labor to provide. So she used that phrase, the safe space phrase, the emotional labor phrase, and she stood in front of the class in tears after I gave my feedback. And
did she shed white woman tears?
Yes, I think I think she did. Yes, actually, but maybe Latina white woman.
Right.
So there was a person sitting to my left who was also Caucasian, a trans woman. And this person said, okay, I think we've heard enough white voices for today. And to me, looked at me and told me to shut up, basically. So that was what happened. And so how did it affect relations among the students? I think that it was very hard to know where people stood with this stuff, because it's chilling. I was, in that course, the only person to continually speak out and push back. And I did so very gently because I was really intimidated. I didn't want to come on strong and say what even the way I would articulate it now, which would still be respectful and kind. I was doing it even more mildly. Like you guys probably have heard how I talk about things. I'm not somebody who's coming in insulting people or trying to cause conflict. I'm really always trying to present a reasonable and conciliatory and agreeable way of coming to discussion around tension, around points of tension. So I was very mild, but I was the only person expressing any concern over this stuff. And you could just hear crickets when I would speak in class. But there were people who outside of class would either email me or thank me privately. And it was always kept very vague, but I had this sense that there were another like 5 or 6 students who were disturbed by some of the content, but weren't willing to speak up. And so that particular day, when I said what I said to the professor about the shallow quality of the course and how I wish we had gone deeper into these issues and really tackled them from a more psychological perspective, and the person to my left told me to be quiet, I felt very angry at the other students that I looked around the room and I knew who they were, and they kept their mouths shut and didn't support me, while this person cried and this person told me to shut up. And I went and cried in the bathroom after the class. I was just like wrecked. It was psychological torture to be put through that.
I've had students come to me and say that it was traumatic. The most traumatic years of their lives was in the program, at least out here in the LA program, but similarly structured to yours. Same school, it's a satellite campus, right? So that's really that's very difficult to hear. That was hard for me to hear, that they were traumatized in their courses by these other professors and I really couldn't do much about it. So, I mean, just the fact that you're sharing this is important for people to be able to hear what's going on and understand the point of view of somebody who's actually sat there and went through it and was tortured, psychologically tortured by it. Was it, I mean, even verbally assaulted or abused in some way. I mean, there was
yeah, and there were times when the teacher brought up things that I had written in those private journals and threw them back at me in class.
oh
So
gosh, I mean, there's just so
yeah, it
many
was a difficult
violations
process
on every level of doing that. Jakob,
and
go
I
ahead.
wonder how calculated that is on their part. You know, when you have a student who's not going along with the program.
Oh, it's very
how,
calculated.
yeah, are they really, do they
Yes,
have do they have
yes.
like a procedure for
It's
shaming
not
you into submission,
yeah,
or what is that?
there's nothing that's in writing about shaming you,
Mhm.
but there is a conversation to be had that you need to be discussing those things and somehow bring them up and see how that student responds. That, again, this is behind the curtain inside baseball stuff. So it's
Yeah.
what I witnessed and experienced as a professor, which was, yes, there are sort of these ways to deal with it are we'll you know, bring it up in the class and see how people respond, and that just kind of gives you ammo if you get to use later by being able to document what was said in class, you know, from the student who actually is of concern, so to speak. So it's not written anywhere, but it is implied, it is encouraged. And when you are in training or you're being mentored, you are mentored in a fashion in which, you know, you're going to agree to do it.
Okay.
So that doesn't surprise me. I mean, I'm horrified and mortified. At the same time, when I take a step back and sort of take a breath, I can recall and take myself back to my professor days. I can recall conversations that I've had where, you know, other professors were talking about distressing something that was confidential that they shouldn't have shared anyway, and used it as material to bring up in class to try to sort of bury the person. I mean, there was a thought process behind it, even if it wasn't written in stone. It wasn't in our handbook, but it certainly was encouraged.
Yeah, it is just such a risky space to go into when the wrong people are being given so much power over a person's well-being and over a person's future career even. I'm thinking about, I know from your videos, it became evident to you, and it seems to be rather true, that they've been following your videos and the videos you've been released as well. And I wonder what they think when you share in your videos that certain students privately maintained their convictions that were at odds with this critical social justice ideology. In other words, they failed to adequately indoctrinate these people. They failed to adequately penetrate their minds to know what they're thinking and to change and to monitor and to control that. And I think that might be a source of great frustration to them. It's going to be interesting to see how they're going to manage the thought control going forward.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't know if they are monitoring my videos now. Probably, maybe. I don't know. I've done a lot of videos. It would take a lot of time. Kind of makes me happy to think of somebody getting paid to sit and watch my videos.
You're living rent free in their heads. Trust me, you are living rent free in their heads.
Well, I was contacted by someone. Well, I've been contacted by a number of Antioch students at this point. It's been about 6 months since I started this process now, a little more, maybe going on 7, but so I was contacted a few weeks after my first video by a student who sent me memos that had been sent to the whole student body about me that I had not received. So they had not sent them to my student account, which was, they'd kind of monkeyed around with that a little bit. And so there was some issues with it, but I had not received these. And these memos were like setting up a crisis line for people to call for 24-hour support because of my videos. And please don't watch them. They're like, there's this person putting these videos out. Do not watch them, but contact our crisis line. This person is a white supremacist, transphobe. And it was like they said that I was centering whiteness and that it was this really, and I at the time, and I've posted these on my Substack, which you can go and look at, and I've got a video too where I go through them in video form where you can read what they wrote, and it and this is pretty early in the process, so then there's like 70 something videos on my channel now, but this is within like the first 5 or 10 of them. So it's, you can watch what I said and then watch what they said about me. And at the time I said it's a gift. They gave me a gift because they proved my point that
I mean,
what I'm saying is so very mild.
Yes.
I'm not a white supremacist by any
No.
stretch of the imagination. And for them to be able to cast this kind of, it's such clear indoctrination propaganda. Do not watch her. Trust us that she is a white supremacist.
I mean, it's to me, it's like, if it wasn't so harmful, it's actually laughable. And I laugh not because I'm making light of your feelings and what you've been through. I laugh because it is absolute absurdity. And it is so absurd that sometimes I don't know how to even take it in other than to laugh it out.
Yeah, no, I think that's an appropriate response.
Laughable to spend
I do too.
This kind of time and effort and energy. And every student out there right now who attends and pays tuition should be angry as all hell, because those tuition dollars are going toward these people that are taking time to write about you, all of this nonsense that's not true. They're spending their time that they should be preparing courses, meeting with students, encouraging, having encouraging conversations with their advisees, etc. The list goes on. Not sending hate mail out about you that is incorrect, that not one thing you said has ever suggested that you believe any of those points or that you are encapsulating any of those ideas. And so people are paying money to these people, and that's how they're spending their time for you to live rent free in their heads, basically.
So your point about the failure to fully indoctrinate students, I wonder about that too. And I can't help but think that is likely a reason that my journals were being shared, was to examine how someone is pushing back. Just an examination of students who fail to uptake the ideology. And so they probably study these things in order to, tailor their arguments to help maximize their potential success with their indoctrination. I mean, I can only imagine that that's a part of it. But at the end of the day, if students refuse to speak up, does it really matter if they took it in or not? Because they're not going to speak up now. I mean, are they going to speak up after they graduate? No, because now their license is on the line. They're just going to keep going for it. If you're too afraid to say this is wrong when you know that this is wrong, when are you going to do it? Like, what's it going to take?
Do you want that kind of a therapist? That's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question.
It makes me wonder about something else. And maybe we can steer the discussion into that direction a bit. Many people will listen to these videos. Some odd student will stumble across them. Some will be thoroughly indoctrinated. Others will be sitting on the fence. Others will be convinced but quiet. What do they need to know? What do they need to think about seriously?
I think that there are a lot of things. So
That's right.
The people who are thoroughly indoctrinated, what is it going to take to get them to question? I don't know what that is, but I think that if we just speak about things openly without feeling intimidated, I'm not worried about what people who are in that camp are going to think of me. I'm not worried about trying to tailor my language in order to make it palatable to people who are fully on board with social justice ideology. I'm not going to try to speak in a soft and gentle way to get them to hear it, but I do want to speak to them. I'll speak plainly. And if something that I say makes them angry or makes them question, I hope that they follow up on it. Follow up, find out why you think I'm wrong. And then maybe that opens the door to a discussion. Maybe that opens their mind just a little bit to say, maybe I've been learning something that's rigid and has no room for intellectual curiosity. maybe we can open that door just a little bit by having fearless conversations in a calm and gentle and reasonable manner that doesn't seek to, I mean, there's other tools, right? Mockery is a tool. People use humor.
Mhm.
People use really acerbic statements and really, you know, harsh counter propaganda, sort of counter ideological. Like I think of like Matt Walsh or somebody who I actually like, but it's not my style, you know. But I think just through fearless but gentle and reasonable conversations, you can help maybe to just make people question just a little bit, even if they're questioning because they think I'm wrong. That's fine. But people who are concerned about it and yet not speaking about it at this point, not making a move, still going along, still just afraid of consequences. I think that it's such an individual decision, whether or not and when to say, I don't agree. But are you doing yourself any favors by kicking the can down the road? And what are you winning for yourself with your silence? What are you saving? What are you preserving? Because this is going some scary places. This is a full indoctrination. This is what's happening with young people in education is really concerning. The culture that we will have tomorrow is not going to resemble the culture that we still have right now or that we had yesterday.
Yes.
If people don't find it in themselves to conscientiously object. And that doesn't mean you have to go out and be an activist, and it doesn't mean you have to start a YouTube channel or whatever. It just means when you have opportunities to say no, they're going to come gradually. Most of them come very gradually. It's just pushing the line a little back, so you're going to take another step back. And it's but find your line and hold to it, even if you feel silly for doing it because everybody around you says, what's the big deal? It's just a pronoun. What's the big deal? It's just an acronym. It's just AFAB or whatever it is. Find a line and hold the line and refuse to budge and be respectful and be reasonable and do it the way it feels right to you. But I'm not sure if that really answers your question.
I mean, most of these students, I want to say most of these students would be smart enough to know about psychological processes, would be smart enough to be able to notice certain things that might not be optimal in terms of psychological functioning. I'm sure many of them have noticed the very destructive trend within this ideological realm, where they really want to go out to destroy and dismantle. I'm sure many of them have noticed how envious, how resentful this ideology and its adherents can be. I mean, I'm sure they must have encountered it somewhere. I'm sure they must have noticed that no one's actually safe. It's like Christine and I spoke the other day. It's like a school of piranhas, piranhas, as they say in America, devouring a corpse or a carcass. And then in that maw, some of them nick the other one just slightly with a fin or with a tooth, and that one starts bleeding. They'll start devouring that one as well. And we see this. I mean, ever so often we hear about yet another group being earmarked for destruction, yet another aspect of Western society that needs to be dismantled. Now, recently, classical music. Imagine that.
Yes.
A former president of Stonewall that was established in Great Britain to push for the integration of gay and lesbian people in wider society. The former president of Stonewall is now recently declared to be a heretic. You're not safe.
No, you're right.
Even if you're an ally, you're not safe. They turn on
you're not safe
like that because of this group think, this group mentality, this mob mentality.
Yes, it's a feeding frenzy.
It's a feeding frenzy, and the mob does not have adequate reality contact. I always say The mob isn't in contact with reality. The mob is in contact only with the imaginary. And what happens in the imaginary is three things: desire, fear, and aggression. And if you're the target of any of those of those emotions, whether in reality you deserve it of that or not, you will be the victim. Because that is the nature of mobs.
I love that piranha metaphor. That's very, very good.
I do have one closing question about mental health and the profession, and where do we go from here in your eyes? What do you see? What do you see as the next most reasonable step for us to take as mental health professionals? I know you're not practicing, but those of us that still are, and want to move out of this, sort of captured.
Yeah. Oh gosh, Christine, I think that's such a good question, because this is one that occupies a lot of my thoughts. I opened a coaching practice myself in the fall of 2021. Let me think. Yes. And so about a year and a half ago ish. And it's been going very well. And I make it very clear that I'm not operating under a medical mental health clinical model. It's not a practice in which people are going to receive a diagnosis and a treatment plan. I operate differently than that. And I think of what I do as more existential and philosophical than clinical, of course, because I lack that clinical piece. I'm not licensed, and so there's that. But I think that it's a really good question. What do we do when mental health training programs are, by and large, very subject to ideological capture? And who's going to come out of those training programs? You're going to have people who either come out indoctrinated or come out psychologically harmed and having to rebuild themselves because they've been through a gauntlet. And so is this a thing that we want to keep recommending new students who want to go into this field to do? Oh yeah, just go through this and pay this terrible institution that's going to tell you all these terrible things, but you got to go through it so you can come out on the other side and de-indoctrinate yourself. I mean, I don't know if that's a wise thing to keep counseling people to do for their careers. And yet, is there a substitute? Is there something else that we have? I don't think it's a great idea for people to necessarily just go hang up a shingle and call themselves a coach just because they want to practice, but if they lack the training, because there are some valid and very valuable trainings that you receive when you're learning how to work with people in this capacity. So I see a great need for a parallel training industry to come up. Personally, I also have issues with some of the clinical work. Aside from social justice, I have concerns over the way that diagnosis is being used in mental health. And, that's kind of a tangent. I know we mostly are addressing the social justice thing, but I think that it is related.
Yes.
In my program, for instance, when we were studying assessments and diagnosis and treatment, we were paired with other students and told to give, we did these mock therapies stuff, that mock therapy sessions that were based on real issues that the student is facing. And we were told to diagnose them. And what we were told is everybody has a diagnosis in the DSM. Every single person has a diagnosis. So if you don't think you can find it, talk to your professor and we'll find it for you. And so this idea that just by virtue of going to see a counselor, you will receive a mental health diagnosis, I think that should be alarming. And that's the trend right now. That's the clinical mindset. And so that's why I see personally a need for something to develop that is more philosophically based and less medically and clinically based. So
I'm floored, because in any of the assessment classes I taught, we always used mock everything. So mock stories and mock people. And we actually created role plays that would include mental health issues that would lead to diagnosis on purpose. So pick the diagnosis, then play the role to express what that diagnosis would be. I have never heard of them actually using real students and their own real story
Well,
to
yeah, and you
provide
would
a
think these,
diagnosis. It's absolutely just when I think it can't get any worse,
it gets worse.
yes, it gets worse. And that
Yeah,
everybody has a diagnosis. I mean, this is highly problematic in my opinion.
you would think these would be some pretty high functioning people. I mean, in terms of,
Yes,
you know, where you are
Sure.
psychologically and your mental health, you would think. And yet every single one of them has multiple diagnoses that can be applied. And as mental health care becomes increasingly subject to insurance regulation and payment, it incentivizes the use of ICD-10 codes and
for
DSM
sure.
diagnoses.
Yes, that's
And
how
so,
you get
yes, so
paid.
that, yeah,
Yes.
so,
Uh-huh.
so there you go. And I think that I know it's a tangent, but I think these two things converge. And personally, I see the need for training models that, that set both the critical social justice ideology and the clinical stuff to the side and
Yeah.
teach people how to work with people and skills training, counseling skills.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to mention, I just want to reiterate what you said. I think parallel institutions, parallel structures is what is currently needed. I mean, we're forming networks. I know the majority of people have not fully bought into this ideological capture. You only need 30% of people to buy into something like this for the culture to change. The majority of people have certainly not bought into this. So there are experts out there. There are people with many skills, with a lot of experience, who they're possibly employed by many of these structures. But as the walls are closing in on them, they will have to make a call sometime about whether they're going to go along with it or not. And I think it is necessary for us to start thinking about building networks, informing the public more thoroughly as to what is going on, alternative media outlets, writing articles, establishing alternative journals, writing books. And so we can list more and more of these possible alternative structures, as you said. I think that is the way forward. I don't think we should waste our time trying to turn the boat around, as it were. I think we have enough infrastructure available still to start thinking about alternative structures. Yeah.
I appreciate your optimism.
All right.
Cautiously optimistic.
Yes, cautious. Well, this is to be continued. What a wonderful conversation, and so enlightening and so educational and useful, Leslie. So thank you so very, very much for coming on today.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for inviting me to have this conversation.